Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Now, if you close your eyes for a second and just picture the Roman Empire, you probably imagine endless hordes of heavily armored legionaries, right? Just mindlessly charging into battle, conquering the entire ancient world through sheer, overwhelming brute force. Well, that is the classic Hollywood illusion. Today, we are going to completely dismantle that myth. We're going to look at the real hidden mechanics of how Rome actually held on to its vast territories. And I promise you, their true superpower was far more sophisticated and, honestly, far more psychological than just swinging swords.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to systematically deconstruct the Roman playbook, starting with the grand strategy myth itself. Then we'll hit the economy of military force, deterrence and psychology, managing client states, legions versus the auxilia, and finally, the power of perception. Let's get to it.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the grand strategy myth. So we really need to reframe how we think about Roman dominance entirely. Their survival for centuries wasn't just about tactical battlefield superiority. In fact, their weapons were frequently matched or even outclassed by their enemies. Instead, their success relied on a highly calculated system of statecraft. Take this classic Roman maxim: if you want peace, prepare for war. The Romans fundamentally understood the paradoxical logic of strategy. They realized that military power is actually conserved and maximized when it's used for political coercion rather than being wasted in constant, grinding combat. They literally didn't want to fight endless battles. They wanted to organize their forces so menacingly that they won without ever having to draw a sword. Moving right along to Section 2, economy of military force. Get ready for some absolutely mind-blowing math here, because how the Romans managed their known world looks a lot less like a brute force military occupation, and more like a brilliant, high-stakes heist pulled off by a shockingly small skeleton crew. 300,000. Seriously, take a moment to let that number sink in. An entire Mediterranean empire spanning 3 continents, stretching from the shores of Britain, along the Rhine and Danube rivers, all the way down to the deserts of Syria and North Africa, was guarded by a total ground force of just roughly 300,000 troops. That's about 29 legions. When you consider the thousands of miles of frontier and the millions of people living within the empire, that is an incredibly thin line of defense. And the exact breakdown of that force shows you how they pulled off this magic trick. That surprisingly small military was split almost perfectly in half. You had the legions, making up 50%, which were heavy infantry composed of long-service Roman citizen volunteers. Then you had the auxilia, making up the other 50%, providing the cavalry and light infantry, and they were drawn entirely from non-citizens. As we're going to see, this highly specific division of labor was basically the absolute engine of their military economy.
Which brings us to Section 3, deterrence and psychology.
So if you've only got 300,000 soldiers, you obviously can't just build a giant fortified wall around the entire empire and guard every single inch of it. So how does a small military actually control a massive, spread-out population? By conquering the mind. Let's look at the famous siege of Masada in the remote Judean desert. The Jewish war had essentially been won at this point. Only Masada was still holding out, occupied by just a few hundred isolated rebels on a completely inconsequential rock with literally zero strategic or economic value. And yet the highly practical Emperor Vespasian committed a massive force of thousands of Roman troops, spending years building an enormous siege ramp just to reach them. Why go to such absurd lengths for a rock? Well, if you look at it purely from a tactical view, it seems like a colossal waste of manpower, engineering, and resources, right? But from a strategic view, Masada wasn't about a mountain in the desert at all. It was an empire-wide broadcast of psychological deterrence. It was a terrifying, undeniable message to anyone anywhere in the empire. Rome will pursue rebellion to the absolute ends of the earth, regardless of the cost or how long it takes. They were essentially buying future obedience through an absolutely terrifying display of extreme, methodical effort.
Next up, Section 4, managing the client states. Now, fear alone obviously isn't enough to manage borders day in and day out. To handle these frontiers, the Romans relied heavily on a concept called amicus populi Romani, or friend of the Roman people. It sounds incredibly polite, doesn't it? But honestly, it was a highly calculated proxy ruler system. The Romans knew they couldn't afford to permanently station those 29 legions on every single border, so they just outsourced their border defense to local kings and tribes. These client states absorbed the daily, low-intensity threats of border raids and provided geographic depth to slow down any major invasions. I mean, why bleed Roman citizens and drain the treasury when a proxy king in Cappadocia or a tribal chief in Germany can do the dirty work for you?
And here is the exact step-by-step Roman playbook for manipulating these client states and keeping them totally compliant. Step 1, pay subsidies. Just buy their loyalty with cold hard cash. Step 2, grant citizenship and fancy titles to their leaders, essentially bribing their egos. Step 3, foster internal rivalries so these tribes and kingdoms stay divided and never ever unite against Rome. And Step 4, always maintain the latent threat of total annihilation if they happen to step out of line. It required constant, high-wire diplomacy, for sure, but it saved Rome immense military resources in the long run.
All right, Section 5, Legions versus the Auxilia. So how was this specific two-tiered army actually tailored to support this grand strategy on the ground? Well, the Roman military was incredibly specialized. The legions weren't just your average fighters. They were heavily armed combat engineers. They're the ones out there building the roads, the camps, and the siege works. But because they were heavy infantry fighting in tight formations, they were slow. That is exactly where the Auxilia came in. Drawn directly from the tribal frontiers, they provided the vital mobility, the cavalry screens, the archers, and the hit-and-run tactics that the heavy legions completely lacked. But here's the real hidden internal dynamic: escalation dominance. The Romans essentially used their non-citizen auxiliary troops for the messy, daily grind of border skirmishes. But those heavily armed, highly disciplined citizen legions were always looming right there in the background. They served as the ultimate backup, and not just against foreign empires either. They were there to suppress any potential revolts from their own non-citizen auxiliary troops. The heavy legions literally ensured the loyalty of the Auxilia simply by existing.
And finally, Section 6, the power of perception.
Let's pull all these threads together to really summarize the ultimate paradox of Roman imperial strategy. The Roman historian Tacitus actually hit the nail on the head. They achieved more by policy than by force. Rome's true superpower was not a constant, bloody display of muscle. It was the highly efficient hoarding of force. By utilizing the Auxilia, meticulously managing proxy client states, and orchestrating highly visible, terrifying examples of retribution, like Masada, they manipulated the minds of their enemies. They made everyone believe that total destruction could be unleashed at any second, which meant they rarely ever actually had to use those precious legions.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating final thought to wrap up this explainer. In today's world, do modern superpowers rely more on actual kinetic military force or on the psychological perception of that force? When you look around at modern proxy wars, buffer states, and the projection of military power across the globe, it really begs the question: did the grand strategy of the Roman Empire ever really disappear, or did it just lay the blueprint for the modern world? Take a moment to think about that. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.